Okay, we're following some breaking news. CBS News can now report that Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle is resigning her position following that grilling she received by lawmakers on Capitol Hill yesterday. CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion is following this for us. The news just in, Nikole, what can you tell us?
Well, what I can tell you is that we did hear a short time ago from Speaker Mike Johnson, who, of course, addressed reporters as this news came in. He said that I am happy to see that she has heeded the call of Republicans and Democrats, and now we have to pick up the pieces. We have to rebuild the American people's faith and trust in Secret Service. The Secret Service has an incredibly important responsibility of protecting the president and former presidents and other officials in the executive branch, and we've got a lot of work to do in that regard. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit of what he said, but that was his response to reporters a short time ago, Vlad. And as you know, of course, there have been bipartisan calls for the Secret Service director to do just that. If you watch that very contentious hearing before the House Oversight Committee, members on both sides were really incensed at some of her responses. And while certainly respecting that this assassination attempt remains under investigation, they felt that she really wasn't as forthcoming as she should have been, that she should have been able to provide more details to lawmakers. And this really was a dereliction of duty on her part, enabling that gunman to be able to have that clear line of sight to the president at that Butler rally. Some lawmakers actually went to see for themselves yesterday in Butler. And that was kind of their impression, that this was just a very clear line of sight, that type of suspicious person and gunman should have been stopped much sooner, especially considering that some of these Secret Service agents were apparently notified some 2 to 5 times before the gunman took those shots. That was something that came out at yesterday's hearing. So lawmakers across the board really incensed by that testimony, which is why those calls for her resignation really started to grow. But now, as you're hearing from the speaker, a sense of relief that hopefully the agency can chart a new path forward.
Nikole, she did take a grilling from members of both sides of the aisle yesterday. And I guess the question for a lot of people, if you're just joining us here on CBS News 24/7, the breaking news that we are talking about right now is that the Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle has resigned. This after going up to Capitol Hill yesterday and sitting in a hearing where she was questioned by lawmakers about her department's, her service's reaction to the potential assassination of former President Donald Trump. So, Nikole, what kind of explanations? I know that at the opening of her statement, she took full responsibility, but lawmakers were really trying to understand some of the things that you just pointed out, right? How, for example, were authorities warned by rally-goers that there was potentially a threat? How, at one point, the shooter was actually identified as somebody who was behaving suspiciously? How did she address the questions as to why nothing was done before he got up on that roof with that rifle to take that shot at the former president?
Yeah, well, to your point, she did acknowledge that this was a failure on the part of her agency, or her former agency. But look, I think one of the things, or the distinctions that was made in the hearing, is kind of what is considered a suspicious person versus what is a real threat. And so what the Secret Service director did note is that, having a backpack at a rally may be suspicious, but isn't necessarily a threat. Having a rangefinder may be suspicious, but isn't necessarily a threat. But again, that was not really an answer that lawmakers were seeking. And so, for instance, there was an exchange with Marjorie Taylor Greene where she said something to the effect of, well, what about when you have a man lying down on a roof that people are pointing at and screaming at? Is that a threat? And then the Secret Service director said, well, that individual was neutralized. So that was her posture through much of the hearing yesterday.
All right, Nikole Killion for us on Capitol Hill. I know, Nikole, you've got to go update your reporting for CBS, so I'm going to let you go. Thank you very, very much for spending some time with us on the breaking news that the Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle has now resigned. I want to continue the conversation with CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, who's also been covering the story for us. Scott was actually at that rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, at that moment where the former president was almost assassinated by a shooter. Scott, let me just get your reaction to the news. We sort of thought that this might happen. I mean, there was really no way that she could hold on to that position, but let me just get your reaction.
I just got a text message from one of the rally goers I've been in communication with since July 13th, and she says, it's about time. It had to happen. The vulnerabilities that led to this historic, almost preposterous security failure on July 13th were going to lead to resignations and firings, and the director may just be the first. Kimberly Cheatle's position atop the Secret Service was simply untenable after that relentless, merciless, withering set of criticism she took yesterday from both parties. There was no safe harbor for her yesterday during that congressional hearing, not just because of the calamitous failures in Butler, Pennsylvania, but because she was not offering answers to a congressional committee that was starving for answers on behalf of their constituents. Director Cheatle said because the FBI is investigating that crime scene in Butler, Pennsylvania, she says she was limited in what she could say about the evidence gathered, about the timeline of the shooter, about what the Secret Service knew about the shooter and has learned about the shooter. That lack of answer to that type of question was not going over well with this congressional panel, with all of Congress. There were these calls potentially to impeach her, and it is striking at this unique political moment for both parties to call for anything, including the Secret Service director's resignation, Vlad.
Yeah, which shows you that when in times of national crisis, Scott, as you know, as someone who's covered the Hill for many, many years, in times of national crisis, which certainly this was, members of Congress, Democrat, Republican, Independent, can come together and demand accountability for those who have very, very important positions. In this case, the Secret Service charged with protecting the life of the president's family, the vice president, and nearly failing at that one task that they have, at least as far as the presidential protection is concerned. Did Kimberly Cheatle, just to give our audience an understanding of who she is, she's relatively new in her position. Do you have a sense of her biography, her background, what led to her being named to this position, and what understanding she had of what it requires to guard the president and the president's family, Scott?
She's a lifer with the Secret Service. She had been there for decades, an institutionalist inside that agency. This is, by orders of magnitude, the largest failure of this agency in modern times, in the last 43 years. But it's not the first issue to surface involving the Secret Service. There have been other leadership changes in the past. It was just recently, in recent years, that someone managed to break into the home of the nation's national security advisor, which is guarded by Secret Service. There were fence jumpers at the White House a decade ago, one of which got inside the East Room through the front door of the White House. There have been other pieces of scrutiny that have fallen on this agency, but nothing of the magnitude of this. And it's worth noting for so many people that this is a failure that not only led to the near assassination of a presidential candidate, killed a longtime firefighter. It wounded two other men who were sitting in chairs at a rally, and it traumatized any number of the thousands of people who were there and had to duck bullets and duck for cover, some of them with their children. This is a historic failure by the Secret Service, and it took just 24 hours after her testimony for her to stand down.
Yeah, and Scott, I mean, you raise an excellent point, and we can put up for our viewers a timeline of how this assassination attempt, as far as authorities understand it, took place. And why I think this is so interesting, look, we sadly, tragically, horrifically in American history, there have been presidents who have been assassinated. There have been presidents who have been shot by would-be assassins, including, of course, in my lifetime, President Reagan. We know there was also an assassination attempt on President Ford. And yet, in all of those instances, or at least in the case of Reagan's attempt, it just sort of came out of nowhere, where a guy in a crowd just approached the president as he was leaving an establishment, a building. When you look at this timeline, it clearly, for anybody who's not in law enforcement, just a layperson looking at this, and you have people at the rally saying, hey, look, there's a guy up there with a gun. That is what I think is galling to members of Congress and to the American people.
And members of Congress leaned into that hard yesterday, Vlad, that not only was this a systemic failure, but there's concern about future vulnerabilities unless there's some type of overhaul or big change inside how the Secret Service does its business, including with presidential candidates, because it wasn't some master of crime or some, mystery theater type of plot here. It was a 20-year-old who lived an hour away, who figured out this vulnerability, had an AR-15 a football field away from a presidential candidate atop of a roof. If they can't stop that, what's to say there's going to be competence in this agency to stop more elaborate actors, state actors going against U.S. targets? So what members of Congress were saying with something of a synchronized voice yesterday is there have to be changes to give us some confidence in the performance of this agency in the future. If a 20-year-old from Bethel Park, Pennsylvania can figure out a vulnerability, the agency needs to do much more to lock things down. And there are a few other threads in yesterday's testimony that were telling. When the director did acknowledge that they had this person in their sights as a suspicious character 2 to 5 times before the former president took the stage, that he was allowed to take the stage despite somebody being deemed suspicious in such close proximity, in such a short time frame, and that nobody had been fired. That didn't sit well with members of this panel, and I think, Vlad, that infused calls for her resignation with an energy yesterday that even surprised folks who were in the committee room, that people walked out seemingly on the same page that she had to go.
Yeah, the other thing, Scott, and you raise an excellent point, and it just sort of got me thinking, if the former president of the United States, who was guarded by what all accounts should be an elite protection service, the Secret Service, which has been tasked with protecting the president's family, as we know, if that person, that shooter, is able to exploit what they see as a vulnerability in that protection that the Secret Service is offering, because he has a weapon that can be used to fire at a greater distance than what was used, for example, we talked about Ronald Reagan, which was a handgun. If the president is at risk, then what about our children who are in schools who are unprotected by, and we've seen that tragically, horrifically play out over and over and over again. So this exploitation of vulnerabilities coupled with the access to weapons and firearms at a level that did not exist back in 1981, if I got my history right about when that assassination attempt happened on Ronald Reagan, you're looking at an uphill battle, and so that's why things need to change at the service.
That came up a lot during the hearing yesterday. There's a lot of kids in schools who don't have Secret Service protection, so the availability of AR-15s is going to be something Democrats lean into hard politically coming out of this. Now that there's been some initial accountability at the Secret Service, watch for congressional Democrats to make an argument that the Congress needs to do more to rein in AR-15s across the country. And I'll tell you something else, that's going to start this afternoon.
Looking forward to that conversation, Scott.